Good morning. So happy here to see friends I made several years ago and make new acquaintances. I want to thank Anders very heartily and everyone connected with organizing and facilitating this really important and significant conference. It's an important topic. It's a timely topic, and it's one I'm finding I'm learning a lot from those who are here for this two-day event. On a work-related trip to Boston, Massachusetts back in 2012, I found myself with a few hours of downtime on a very chilly day. So I headed to the Museum of Fine Arts to walk around indoors and get a cup of tea at their cafe. To my surprise, I discovered an exhibition titled Beauty as Duty, Textiles on the Home Front in World War II Britain. And there, in pride of place, at the center of the room, was an extraordinary object, an enormous lace panel, almost 5 by 2 meters, commemorating the Battle of Britain, the desperate effort to keep Germany from invading Britain that took place between July and October of 1940. I work on air war and atmospheric politics, and frankly, I'd never seen anything like it, a lace curtain depicting warfare. Amid the climbing roses and curling leaves that I would expect to see in fine lace were numerous aircraft in vigorous acts of defending the homeland. Figures of aviators, searchlights, ground artillery installations, falling or burning buildings, and one of Prime Minister Winston Churchill's most well-known quotes, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." The air war occupies a large section in the center of the work, and I spent quite a lot of time moving closer and farther back, viewing the piece from different angles. I was truly stunned by its scale. I wish it was here so you could see it, and they had lit it very dramatically. And what seemed to me to be the novelty of it, a gigantic lace curtain depicting air war. This lace panel was one of 38 made by the Dobsons and M. Brown and Company to celebrate the successful repelling of the attempted German invasion. I subsequently learned that the Dobson and Brown Company, which usually made lace curtains, had turned their production during wartime to mosquito and camouflage netting. The commemorative panels were created to keep the expert designers and draftsmen occupied and up to date in their more advanced skills, and they were sent to sites in the Commonwealth. The panels were sent to sites in the Commonwealth as well as in Britain. So several of them still exist in places like New Zealand and Australia, Canada. Many of the details had specific resonance and significance to the makers. For example, I discovered this nugget of information on Facebook. Apparently, the aviator depicted at the lower left edge of the panel is the grandson of the founder of the company, a casualty in the first days of the war when his Hawker Hurricane, the nose of which is shown just above and behind him, crashed during nighttime training. The Hawker Hurricane was a single-seat plane, and it was the workhorse of the Royal Air Force. It played a huge role in the Battle of Britain, so its presence there has significance. But the Battle of Britain lace panel was not the only surprise that day. As part of the same exhibit, I also saw lots of scarves with war or propaganda thematics and dresses with so-called victory prints. The acetate and silk scarves included images of aircraft carriers, military reports, notable figures like Churchill, regimental badges, and propagandistic messages. I bought the catalog and made a mental marker to try to find out more about these evocative instances of everyday militarism, but I was busy at the time and I never quite followed up. My next startling encounter with wartime arts and crafts occurred on yet another work trip, this time to New York City in 2017, where I visited the American Folk Art Museum to see an exhibition titled War and Peace that featured a remarkable collection of quilts made by soldiers. This time I was better prepared because I had read an article about the exhibit in the New York Times, so I had made sure to schedule a visit. The quilts, which were all exquisite, dated mostly from the Crimean War, as well as other British imperial wars and occupations during the 19th century. Sometimes called convalescent quilts because they are made by soldiers who were recovering from injuries, the quilts were pieced together using wool fabric from military uniforms. I walked around this exhibit for quite some time, taking in these richly colored, still vibrant artifacts, thinking about wounded soldiers and their use of the materials at hand. This time, I came home and started a folder, optimistically titled Textiles, War, Everyday Militarism, fully intending to dig into this area of research more fully, but time and the press of other projects and commitments pulled me away once again. So the invitation to talk to you on the theme of war and aesthetics brought me back to these memories and objects. I went digging through my photos in my phone. I could talk to you about cartography and aerial photography, photogrammetry, remote sensing, and drone aesthetics. These are all topics I've written about extensively over the years, but recent work I've been doing on wartime photo montages has brought me closer to the history of arts and crafts and considerations of fabrication, reawakening my desire to think more about divisions between high and low culture, art and craft in everyday militarism. And I'm trying to push myself to think harder about formats, materials, and production, as well as dispositional theories of visuality and perception in relation to wartime aesthetics. We might think of material infrastructure as unrelated to aesthetics. I'm influenced, however, by Hatim El-Hibri's work on visual infrastructures, the media archaeology scholars, as well as Keller Easterling's notion of disposition. Hatim El-Hibri begins his recent book on media infrastructures of Beirut by observing that media start us in the middle of things. As he points out, there is an incompleteness intrinsic to infrastructure, a spatio-temporality that requires maintenance, sometimes beginning before construction is even completed, and which, by definition, is always ongoing. Scholars like El-Hibri, who work in overlapping fields of media, communications, and visual culture, understand infrastructure as relational and inclusive of affective, sensory, and aesthetic elements. Along similar lines, Lisa Parks and Nicole Starosielski argue for a greater focus on processes and materialities of media distribution to move beyond close textual readings. And I would just say here, nothing against close textual readings, but just in addition to. Adopting an infrastructural disposition, as they put it, shifts our attention beyond mere matter to what animates matter and brings it into politics and power relations. And this is the point that I think is really important, at least for me. Parks and Starosielski remind us that infrastructures tend to, as they put it, normalize behavior such that they become relatively invisible, unnoticed, or internalized, even as they hold the potential for the disruption of that normalization, which can occur during instances of inaccessibility, breakdown, replacement, or reinvention. This resonates with Keller Easterling's explanation of disposition as the unfolding relationship between potentials, not only a shaping of the object, but also a consideration of how it plays its activity in the world. The scholars I've just cited focus on built environments and communications media, but I would like to be so bold as to extend some of their thinking on dispositional infrastructure to wartime fabrics. Wartime fabrics are intensely dispositional in that they bring us into the middle of things in dynamically political moments, yet through their very banality, their characteristic of being in media res, they can blunt our apperception of materiality, of their conditions of fabrication and distribution, of relationality. The infrastructural thingness of fabric is deceptive, distracting us with the message that there's really nothing to see here. I'm going to hazard a few more ideas along these lines, but my comments today are necessarily preliminary, really a sketching out of an interdisciplinary research project. So for these reasons, I will welcome your feedback and suggestions as we move into discussion. When we consider warfare, we don't usually think about lace. But the lace curtain that depicts the Battle of Britain exists, and it challenges any number of issues in relation to the topic of war and aesthetics. It turns out that focusing on a lace curtain from World War II can generate questions about the military-industrial complex, the parameters and definition of warfare, transitions in military procurement and logistics, as well as technological innovation, and cultural practices in relation to gender, class, and nationality. Either that or I'm capable of reading everything into everything, but we'll talk about that later. These sociological and historical elements are crucial, but they also need to be linked to the dispositional matter of fabrication itself, always integral to the making of meaning, as well as objects, whether we're talking about texts or textiles. In the English language, the word fabric derives, of course, from the Latin fabrica, something skillfully produced, or fabricare, to make, construct, fashion, build. I think I have another slide here. No, we'll get there. Sorry. Etymological sources note that the word first signified a building and later on a machine, moving on to indicate something made, that is, fabricated. By the late 18th century, the meaning in English also became pointed specifically to textile, woven, or felted cloth. Importantly, the word fabrication also connotes falseness, fabricating a tissue of lies, for example. So thinking about war through fabric and fiber arts requires a sense of warfare as historically constructed, relational or connecting, and conditional, as shaping or even manipulating meaning in or our sense of reality. But first, what do I mean by fabric and fiber arts? When considering how to define fabric and fiber arts, the history of the division between fine art and craft work rears its troublesome head. Defenders of the skill and expertise involved in the production of handcrafts face the unpleasant choice of trying to raise their disdained practice to the level of academic high art painting or sculpture, and always already failing, or segregating their work into categories like cultural heritage or hobby. Then there's the division between industrially mass-produced and handmade materials and objects. While these divisions are linked to large historical events and movements in modernity, I would argue that they're also entangled in the way that war has evolved in the same time period. And I'll say more about this shortly. Fabric is cloth, and cloth is usually made by weaving or knitting fibers into material of varying thicknesses or fineness, patterned or unpatterned. The fiber, which is usually vegetal, needs to be spun, and frequently it is dyed. Once a fabric has been created, it's often cut into shapes and sewn together in all kinds of different ways. We know this. We take it completely for granted. There's cloth, there's clothing, there are uses for fabrics in the home and in business, in the world, with distinctions in fashion across eras and cultures. This would seem to have nothing to do with serious matters like satellites and surveillance, drones, and distance warfare, or subjects like optics, or materials like aluminum, glass, or concrete, just as we hardly can think about the maker of the so-called pillow lace in the late 18th century when we consider the emergence of neoclassical painting or Napoleonic cavalry or infantry formations, except perhaps as a piquant side note on decoration. We can hardly imagine that a jacquard loom in Nottingham in the 1940s matters in the age of air power, except as a tool for ornamentation of interior spaces. The word decorative is key, linked not only to vulgar or realistic representation, but to the feminine. Certainly anything having to do with fabric is usually associated with female labor or recreation, and therefore either sentimentalized or denigrated. Whether we think of Penelope as the figure of perfect marital fidelity sitting at her loom while she awaits the return of her husband, Odysseus, or Betsy Ross sewing the flag during the American Revolution, or jokes about old ladies and their knitting. Apologies to our friends who are knitting here today. The production and use of fabric, particularly before the industrialization of textile production, is heavily linked to the domestic and the maternal work of care for the family. I want to be crystal clear from the outset that in emphasizing gender, I'm not ascribing to a romanticized or biologically essentialized notion of sexual difference. Across historical periods and locations, we can find men making nets, knitting, weaving, spinning, etc. I was happy to see a photograph of a man knitting in the hallway of this library. And everyone worked at home, if you will, until relatively recently in human history. Yet in the West, discursively, if not materially, in the modern period, women have been heavily associated with fiber arts and the so-called private sphere, and this affects how we view fabric and textile fabrication in wartime and any related aesthetics today. The relation between female cultural and material producers of fabric is, of course, a historically specific construction and one that requires careful demythologization. Therefore, it should not be surprising that feminist researchers and writers have been at the forefront of the study of textiles and fiber arts. And to my mind, some of the most interesting work links women's textile fabrication to political activity, to dissent, and even to violence. For example, in her work on fiber imagery in Stories and Legends about the Trojan Wars, Lois Martin found deadly slings, treacherous snares and nets, and crimson carpets marking a path to murder. Imagery at odds with the trope of Penelope passively sitting at her loom, weaving and unraveling her never-ending shroud. Martin is fascinated instead by Clytemnestra's net, which becomes key in the effort to murder Agamemnon, and is then used as forensic evidence in Orestes' trial for matricide. As Martin writes, rather than being marginalized as soft, superfluous women's work, textiles could have terrifying power as weapons, as agents of torment, and as prizes so alluring as to drive greed out of bounds. Similarly, Julia Bryan Wilson asks, what does it mean to imagine the sewing needle as a dangerous tool and to envision female collective textile making as a process that might upend conventions, threaten state structures, or wreak political havoc? Bryan Wilson argues that textiles are in the fray, and that is they're often in the center of heated disputes, controversies, and disagreements, not only about the materiality of gendered labor, but also integral to debates about the limits or boundaries between high and low cultural production, since their constant use in and affiliation with the everyday triggers suspicions that such boundaries might not exist. It is this instability of textiles' relationality that Bryan Wilson links in some instances to a queer sensibility in politics, specifically through tactility and different sorts of bodily orientations that contribute to volatile interfaces between public and private selves. Above all, Bryan Wilson reminds us that textiles help define our relationships to interiors and exteriors. They shape how we move through space, and they alert others to our sense of self and signal our attempts to collectively belong. In other words, they're dispositional. Lizika Parker, in her now classic work from the early second-wave women's movement, The Subversive Stitch, argued that embroiderers do not just make pretty pictures with thread as part of a frivolous pastime or due to a lack of more profound artistic talent. Rather, for several centuries, women who embroider transform materials to produce sense, whole ranges of meanings, and that the women who do the bulk of such work are and have been powerful fabricators, if you will, of objects and cultures. At this point, I think we need to get a bit more specific. For as Bryan Wilson points out, it matters whose hands hold the needles and under what circumstances. And this brings us to the entrenched mythologies of modernity in relation to textiles and their making, to the fabrication, if you will, of some of capitalism's most enduring fallacies. I'm thinking here of the history of the transition from pre-industrial to industrial and the role of textiles and fiber arts in this pervasive storyline. The gist of this Eurocentric fable goes something like this. For millennia, textiles were produced in the home or in linked cottage industries, primarily by women who were able to pick up or put down their tasks as they were interrupted by the needs of children and family members. In other words, pre-industrial textile production and fiber work were particularly well-suited to the primordial aspects of women's daily lives, and their participation in the sphere of activity was deemed natural. This bucolic situation was altered profoundly as more people moved to cities and production and consumption shifted, often forcibly, from home base to the factory. Textiles take a lot of time to produce by hand, and this made some materials very expensive. It's not surprising then that textiles became one of the first crafts to be industrialized. Textiles and their mode of production make their appearance along these lines throughout Marx's writings, and it's not incidental to note that Engels' father was a cotton manufacturer. I refer to this dominant storyline, and there are elements of this which, of course, are true, but there are also aspects of it which become so pat and glib that I think they sort of need some textualization, if you will. I refer to this dominant storyline as Eurocentric because it tends to gloss over cultural and historical distinctions and collapse everything into the timeline of European industrialization, and also really oversimplifies sexual difference, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have time to get into that. But just for one example that muddies the story of European industrialization of the making of fabric, let's look at India, which had a sophisticated textile industry that had been in operation for centuries. Through the course of their own violent occupation and colonization of India, the British borrowed techniques and designs from that long-standing industry while forcibly shifting production to raw materials and imposing restrictions on domestic finished goods, and then flooding the country with inexpensive material produced in the new British factories, throwing India's spinners and weavers out of work. Not unsurprisingly, anti-colonial movements came to embrace homespun cloth as a powerful symbol of self-reliance and nationalist aspiration, rejecting British factory-made fabric. And the working conditions in textile factories today, now mostly outside Western Europe and the US, continue to be at the center of debates about industrialization, labor markets, and employment sectors, as well as environmental concerns, confirming some elements of the dominant industrialization storyline while refuting others. And so, returning to my thinking with and about the World War II lace curtain, it would seem that we should not be too hasty to embrace all the elements of this dominant story of industrialization in relation to textiles. First, because the line between handcrafted items and manufactured ones are blurry. Mass manufactured goods, especially those with textile elements, are also often in large part made by hand. Indeed, Glenn Adamson argues that the emergence of craft as a coherent idea, a defined terrain as industry's opposite, takes place simultaneously with the rise in mass manufacturing. Modern industry became figured as technically complex, efficient, and scaled for mass production and consumption, and craft was relegated to the hearth and home, discredited and viewed as inferior. But this division, this discursive division, if you will, is taking place at a moment when things are actually much more complicated. The undifferentiated world of making became divided into a set of binaries, including craft industry, freedom, alienation, hand, machine, traditional, progressive. But Adamson reminds us that craft was not a static backdrop against which industry emerged, like a figure from the ground. Rather, the two were created alongside one another, each defined against the other through constant juxtaposition. The discursively blunt division of industry and craft into two opposite social spheres not only bolsters the antinomies of public-private, male-female, empire-colony, etc., it also ignores the material evidence of widespread handcrafting in industrial manufacturing throughout the 19th century and after. As Adamson notes, if we expand our definition of crafts beyond the obviously domestic to include practices like bridge building, leatherwork, carriage making, tailoring, boot making, taxidermy, and the fabrication of scientific instruments, then the strict division between craft and industry weakens considerably. Adamson's not arguing that artisanal work did not take place before the late 18th century or that industrialization did not cause suffering or exploitation. Rather, his research historicizes the making of things and therefore meaning across periods and locations, and reminds us that fabrication is never primordially innocent. You may be wondering what this has to do with warfare. To begin to understand war's fabrications, we have to consider quotidian activities, often in the home, as well as spectacular or exceptional events and work to deconstruct the binaries of domestic, foreign, private, public, industry, craft, and even military, non-military, or civilian. We have to attempt to think through a large and expansive field of objects, methods, personnel, locations, and time periods. And we need to keep in mind always the relational dynamics that sustain these elements. In a lot of my recent work, I've been concerned with the linked antinomies of domestic, foreign, and public-private as a way to identify the practices that give rise to what we would call everyday militarisms. Viet Thanh Nguyen has written that while war is hell, war is normal too. A focus on the quotidian, less spectacular elements of society during times of seemingly endless war allow us to better understand the legitimating mythologies of warfare, its intensely normalizing practices, its dispositional infrastructures. As Stephen Flusty has argued, the best way to understand how neo-imperialism and its wars are created, valorized, or concealed, received, reinterpreted, and even refused is to pay attention to everyday actions and implements. Particularly in the United States, which has been waging war against the indigenous population of the landmass for centuries, fighting colonial wars and prosecuting imperial ventures on a global scale through the use of political and cultural violence, there is a kind of amnesia about warfare that can only be deconstructed through investigations of the ways in which war becomes hidden in plain sight, as it were. And of course, this amnesia is really only for a privileged group of people, but still, it's quite pervasive. Expanding inquiry into everyday militarism directs our attention to the gray sites that are so flat and horizontal, as Pierre Bélanger and Alexander Arroyo put it, as to render them difficult to recognize and represent. In their collaborative work, they've argued that there is a critical deficit of public geographic knowledge on the worldwide footprint of the United States military, the single largest landowner, equipment contractor, and energy consumer in the world. The banality of this information makes it almost invisible. Roads and runways, gates and jersey barriers, fences and fuel tanks, food depots, dairy stands are just a few examples that these cultural geographers mention. Yet this military infrastructure is so vast and omnipresent, we're no longer able to detect its extents, rendered invisible by its scale. The banality of everyday militarism certainly includes fabric and working with fiber. Off the top of my head, I can think of war balloons and parachutes, tents and blankets, flags and streamers, banners, bandages, shrouds, knitted garments, the invention of specific materials like rayon, and I'm sure I'm missing even more prosaic and fundamental examples. Who makes these materials? When and where? Are they at all integral to the military-industrial complex that has overtaken our economies and pivoted national agendas to securitization and policing on a mass scale? Or are they minor entities, sometimes of symbolic value, or simply things that are just there, that move in and out of military utility and into everyday life? Keeping some of these issues and questions in mind, I want to come back to the piece that kickstarted my ruminations, The Lace Curtain that commemorated the Battle of Britain. It was created in Nottingham in the UK, and Nottingham was for over 100 years the lace-making capital of the world. Lace-making around Nottingham developed out of the stocking knitting trade in the late 18th and early 19th century. The knitting frame, which was central to the gradual mechanization of knitted garments, particularly hosiery, was invented in Nottinghamshire in 1589. By 1810, the knitting frames were adjusted to produce netting, which led to lace. Initially, the lace was produced in the home and involved the entire family. Numerous industrial innovations, including the introduction of steam, shifted lace making from one of the most time-consuming and expensive enterprises to a more efficient and therefore more affordable commodity. The process of producing various grades of lace, embroidering and dyeing and finishing, encompassed many skill sets and generated diverse sub-industries. As I've mentioned, this supposedly intensely industrial, mass-produced product required massive amounts of hand finishing. In addition to the lace itself, Nottingham built around 90% of the lace-making machines for the world, many exported to the United States. I was interested to learn that the Nottingham industrial lace machine operators were primarily male, dubbed twist hands, and they were paid by the piece. By World War I, twist hands were among the highest paid factory workers in Britain and were considered to be a highly trained elite workforce. In contrast, surprise, surprise, industrial lace female workers were primarily consigned to finishing, a process that bleached, dyed, and embroidered the product. Working conditions and pay for finishers were among the worst in Britain, rife with tuberculosis, and many workers ruined their eyes at an early age. At the height of the industry, just before World War I, entire families, ranging from grandparents to very small children, were involved in finishing what was otherwise considered to be an industrially mass-produced commodity. Despite all of this extensive handwork, Nottingham lace became the byword for machine-made lace, and it was lace curtains that endured as this industry's primary product into the 20th century. Another prominent mythology about modernity involves the mobilization of apparently civilian industries into wartime production. Here, plowshares are made into swords, as it were. All resources are turned toward the war effort while civilians tighten their belts and open their wallets. It's a good story, and it sort of works for the enormous scale of declared world wars. And the lace industry in Britain and the United States seems to fit into this discourse quite nicely. Yet this powerful myth obscures the ways that many industries have worked closely with governments and militaries at all times and could not possibly have existed without them. And here's where I think we could have had a lot more discussion yesterday about some of the presentism of the ideas about what's so new about brands, et cetera, today. I would quibble with that. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about in the late 1950s was already so deeply entrenched by the late 1950s, as to be virtually invisible, despite the outgoing president's best efforts to bring it into view. I will just say that there's no way to understand everyday militarism without deconstructing the mystique of the military-industrial complex and its complete and utter imbrication in warfare, whether declared wars between standing armies or colonial so-called small wars, which cause injury and suffering over extremely long periods, or the extreme measures of policing and security that accompany both of these examples and spill over into periods of supposed peacetime for marginal and vulnerable communities. Keeping this in mind, I approached the claims that during World War II, many lace factories in Britain and the United States shifted from the production of lace curtains and tablecloths to camouflage netting with some degree of cautious interest. I'm sure it's true, but I haven't been able to track down much about the actual transition in the factories from lace to netting, just matter-of-fact references. In none of the works on camouflage I consulted in the past or recently is there any further mention of how the netting was made, or by whom, or why. Was it the scale of the need for netting that causes change in production, or other considerations? Obviously, there was a high demand. There's much more to learn here. Let me just say a few words, and I promise it's just a few words, about why netting was integral to camouflage. Camouflage had been practiced by hunters to deceive their prey for millennia, but only became a tactic in warfare with the advent of aviation. Once planes could overfly troop positions and installations, the need for protective cover became immediately apparent. Suddenly installations were revealed with startling clarity. The innovation of serial reconnaissance photography during World War I called for sophisticated efforts to manipulate human and machine perception. At first, the camoufleurs, usually referred to by the French term, camouflagers, usually referred to by the French term camoufleurs, painted solid objects in hopefully deceptive colors. The dazzle patterns on ships, foliage on tanks and installations, along with uniform and facial alteration. But these surfaces are highly reflective, and the static nature of the disguise almost announced rather than masked the presence of the object. Stretching fabric over objects and people and decorating or garnishing that fabric with masking elements turned out to be a much more effective method of altering the appearance of sensitive locations and personnel. And the fabric that worked best for this purpose was open-work netting. Netting is basically a mesh that's composed of interspersed loops and knots. It's an ancient art, often associated with fishing, but useful for an infinite number of purposes. The interplay between presence and absence in netting is part of what made it so effective for camouflage in the early era of air power. Not only could it be easily altered, it also offered an inherently dynamic texture, unreflective, flexible, and adaptable. In his 1942 manual, Modern Camouflage, Robert Breckenridge advised that the camouflage netting should never be looked at as a solid, opaque screen. Rather, the openings in the net are as important as the opaque areas. Thus, netting lent itself admirably to the military's aim to conceal the fact that they were concealing, and it was vigorously utilized by the Germans as well as their Allied adversaries. Armies became expert in textual subterfuge, as Hannah Rose Schell has put it, producing the visual illusion of absence through a constant state of transformation. This was accomplished by garnishing the nets this is the official term, garnishing, usually with raffia, scrim, and canvas scraps inserted by female workers on the home front and augmented on site by soldiers with local materials to lend credibility. Camouflage became an obsession with all of the armies involved in World War I, and by World War II, it had achieved what one historian has referred to as a monumental scale. There's so much to say about camouflage, and there's quite a lot of scholarship I don't have time to touch on today. What I want to emphasize is, once again, the infrastructural aspects of the material in the context of wartime. It's clear that camouflage was designed and theorized primarily by men, many of them in the arts, either painters or photographers or designers, many involved in theater, who were deliberately mobilized for this work. Women appear as garnishers, work that followed pattern designs that were carefully preconceived. By World War II, camouflage had become a subject taught in art schools like Pratt Institute in New York City, which started an interdisciplinary lab on the topic in their School of Architecture, or through military camouflage sections like the one organized by the Royal Engineers in Kensington, or the U.S. Army unit at Fort Belvoir in Virginia in the United States. The role of artists in the history of camouflage is just one segment of an expanded inquiry into war art, a field that suffers from its association with government propaganda and vulgar realism, but that requires much more attention and nuanced research. The overlap between cubism and camouflage is a somewhat popular subtopic. You can find lots of conference presentations and articles about it, spurred by Gertrude Stein's anecdote from World War I. Upon viewing a camouflage cannon, Picasso supposedly exclaimed, c'est nous qui avons fait ça. We did it first. And Stein apparently agreed that the Cubists had premeditated the style, if not the function. There were many Cubist painters in the war, of course, and reportedly the chief French camoufleur, Lucien Victor Girard, deliberately involved modernist painters thanks to their understanding of figure-ground relationships, perspective, color, and texture. Given that camouflage aimed to deceive reconnaissance and attack aircraft through manipulating perception and generating illusion, it should not surprise us that surrealists were also drawn into the enterprise both of actual camouflage protection, such as Roland Penrose's efforts to instruct the British Home Guard in do-it-yourself methods of deception, which included not only a manual he wrote and lectures he gave all around the country, but a series of photographs of his lover, the war photojournalist Lee Miller, here provocatively camouflaged. But also Marcel Duchamp, whose string installation at the Coordinating Council of French Relief Societies in 1942 resembled not only a kind of netting, but the trajectories of ground-to-air artillery. This was commented upon at the time. Everything to your left is Duchamp's string. This image to the extreme right is actual ground-to-air artillery, which many people had personal experience with, so naturally they would make the association quite readily. Speaking of surrealism, I think that the camouflaging of the Lockheed Vega aircraft plant in Burbank, California during World War II ranks highly, given that that enormous factory was covered by a giant canopy of chicken wire, scrim netting, and painted canvas, all supported by a scaffolding of posts and cables with roads painted going in and out, along with canvas houses with wash lines, trees, and shrubbery. Fake cars were moved in and out of the scene, and wash was hung and removed at regular intervals to simulate a real town. All of this work was conceived and executed by artists, designers, painters, and builders attached to the military at the time, and who drew upon the expertise they gained. Many of them later went to work to help build Disneyland a few years after the end of the war. You can't make this stuff up, right? As Seymour Wright has pointed out, exact replication was not needed. The aim of such concealment wasn't to hide a target perfectly, but simply to baffle and disorient an enemy flyer for a few critical moments. In drawing together these accounts of lace and netting in this very preliminary consideration of wartime fabrics and fabrication, I've left out many, many examples. There's a considerable body of work on Latin American arpilleras and Hmong story cloths, usually created by women to narrate experiences of political violence. There's also a fascinating literature on war rugs and lots of argument about it. They're produced in Pakistan, for the most part, by Afghans who were made refugees first by the Soviets and then by the US. I couldn't even begin to cover the numerous accounts and analyses of quilts stretching across several centuries. Many of these examples involve courageous dissent, as well as patriotic support for national or local conflicts. They're all moderately to completely representational. Like the lace curtain that commemorates the Battle of Britain, these prosaic examples tell a story, and unlike camouflage netting, they range in practical utility. They all create and enmesh a wealth of dispositional relationships that need further careful thinking with and about. In focusing on an almost kitsch piece like the lace curtain then, I'm trying to make a number of claims, tying knots between loose loops of evidence, if you will. I'm interested in exploring the matter of fabrication and modernity, its modes of production and divisions of labor, certainly, but also the cultural products it creates, its dispositional force. Given the fundamentally structuring aspect of warfare and uneven power relations in modernity, there's no way to understand fabrication without war and vice versa. But that said, it's also crucial to avoid reifying and reproducing exhausted tropes and antinomies that mystify warfare further. Focusing on the everyday, the unspectacular, the banal, and the unlikely elements that nevertheless braid themselves into a culture dedicated to the pursuit of empire through violent means is one step in that much-needed deconstruction, and I think a cornerstone of a critical feminist praxis of dissent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for yet another eye-popping exploration. I don't know how we're doing on time, but we certainly have time for questions. Clara?
I'm going to start this in feminist fashion, but just sharing two anecdotes with you. The first one is that I used embroidery in a class maybe 5-6 years ago. I forget the context. It could have been something with teaching 19th century women's literature or something like that. And I brought about 35 pieces of embroidery to class in order to try to materialize what we were talking about. And I spread them out, and then the class participants, this group of MA students, had to each choose a piece of embroidery and respond to it. And what I found out was that the boys, if you'll excuse my expression, at the back of the class, they came up and they looked at this embroidery. They would look at it, but they didn't want to touch it.
Yeah. Sure.
So there's something there.
Yeah. It's proven that it does make you, it turns you homosexual almost immediately.
The second anecdote is that the last time I saw a young woman embroider, you don't see it all that much, at least here in Denmark. She was embroidering a wall hanging that started at the top, "A woman's place is," and then at the bottom it said, "In the jungle." Oh. So anyway, I was just, those were just my...
Great.
I just had to tell
Very
you about
evocative.
it. Yeah. Anyway, I love your work here, of course, but I was also thinking now that I have Phil Clay right in my line of vision here as I have been listening to you. I haven't read Phil's work in terms of the fabric and the embroidery, the netting, but I wanted to ask you, or so as to spare Phil maybe this afternoon, do you have a sense of whether war writers include fabric for specific purposes, or is it more like Adrienne Rich and Jennifer's Tigers, where you use consciously embroidery to show some sort of resistance?
Wow, what a wonderful question. I reread Phil's work before I came because I knew that he would be here and I wanted to have it more freshly in my mind. And I guess what I would, so I don't I'm not thinking of any direct fabric, but what I would say is that I think that I don't think it's a forced metaphor to say that writers and people who work with textiles or fiber are doing some similar things, because especially people involved in story arts are attempting to create a narrative, and it does involve piecework, if you will. So I think there's all sorts of interesting relations that can be developed and identified between the acts of writing, and especially fiction, and even maybe around truth and fabricate, the fabrication of whether something's really true, or you're stretching the truth, stretching the fabric of the truth, if you will. There's more we could talk about in that regard. I think that would be about as far as I could go. But I think since I myself haven't thought about fabric very much until recently, I have to now look at things with fresh eyes and see what I find.
Yeah, no, that's very productive in this wonderful talk. The thing that immediately came to mind was not fabric directly, but the work of David Jones, the author of In Parenthesis, who, after World War I, part of his training in order to write that great poem was sort of in like the Catholic arts movement and this focus on making and becoming a painter. And there's a tremendous focus on sort of the tactile. And fabric is important, and there's a kind of artistry towards camouflage as well. And also in the military, the first thing you do is have to take care of your uniform and make sure there are no, Irish pennants, and you get, inspected constantly. And it was, for some folks going into the Marine Corps, it struck them as an oddly feminine focus to be so focused on clothing. And yet it's one of the first things when you go into the military that you have to keep squared away.
Yeah.
Oh, and you sew. You sew your own. Yeah, you do have to sew, and you have to write your own name into your towels. Anyway.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm glad to know that.
Yeah, thanks so much for this really rich talk. It's one of those talks where you suddenly see a lot of connections that I never saw before, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about like how the fabric factories in the Low Countries financed the 100 Years' War. I mean, everything sort of like history of warfare is basically just a history of, or could be conceived as also a history of textiles and fabrics. But I guess what I mostly thought about was actually uniforms, which I guess is the most sort of like emblematic, or arguably the most emblematic type of fabric connected to warfare. And I was thinking of the uniform and the nexus it forms with the laws of war, right? That is, I mean, the uniform is basically the most sort of like important component in international humanitarian and sort of like military law, right? That it is what distinguishes between irregulars and normal warriors, right? Normal fighters. It is the basis of the whole post 9/11 legal order or legal disorder, whichever way you want to have it, and what creates a distinction between civilians and military personnel, right? So I feel like our whole legal framework for considering war and war crimes is basically contingent on fabric and uniforms. And I was just wondering whether that was sort of like the law, the text of the law, the textile of the uniform, whether that nexus has been part of your consideration.
I haven't thought about it too much yet, but you give me a lot of food for thought here. And I think also, obviously the whole issue around drone warfare and identification of who is, basically any male of a particular age is perceived to be a threat, which is the sort of stereotype we have of rules of engagement in those battlefields, those battle areas, is complicated by the issue of whether people are wearing identifiable uniforms or whether it's a mode of dress just immediately in a racialized kind of way marks you as a potential target. And part of this involves garb, what somebody is wearing and not only. So there's a lot to think about there, and I'd want to think about that a lot more. But I appreciate that point very much.
Yes, thank you also. And thank you especially, I think, for sort of moving us somewhat beyond the focus on battle, immediate battle, the direct experience of violence, and out to the larger population. And perhaps there was, in a sense, a connection to Anthony's paper yesterday, insofar as at the very end of that paper, he spoke not just of the technologies that are necessary for conducting actual violence, but also for the potentials for the traumatic experience of these technologies in a whole population. So there's kind of that shift from the immediate battle zone to the civilians and to this whole other sphere of war. And that then made me think about how do we read something like this we see up here, like whether lace or rugs. And I'm wondering whether, on the one hand, there's a kind of segue into thinking this as a kind of trauma, or dealing with trauma.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you had the courtesy of sharing an article a couple of days ago that examined precisely some of these Afghan war rugs, and that said, well, really, what has happened is that the market has taken over, and these war rugs are not sort of the expression of the traumatized, individual distant from the war, but nevertheless suffering. No, these are sort of taken over by factories that really sell these people to people like us. So there's a kind of strange distinction there, and I'm wondering, what is your reading then of what we're actually seeing?
Yeah. Oh gosh, I have so much to say about this, and I'll try to keep it as short as possible because I'm mindful of time. There are two angles to this. The first is the importance of this very expanded, giant bucket of everyday militarism. And I have to explain this for a second, which is I began all of this work that I've been doing for many, many years with GPS and the global positioning system during the first Persian Gulf War, because that's how old I am. And I started because I was working on mapping. As somebody in the humanities trying to think about cartography and landscape art, but GPS originated as a cooperation between the military and civilian efforts to create better coordinated digital product and process. And so I had to start paying attention to the military. I certainly was interested, but that hadn't been my focus. But in learning about GPS, I had to learn a lot about the military and then about, so precision warfare, which was supposedly the hallmark of the revolution in military affairs, which turned out it wasn't very as precise as advertised. So to me, I've just from the get-go, this very uneasy relationship between supposedly civilian and military, and market and not market, has been my interest. And I think it's really fruitful because it's not to say that everything just turns into the same thing, but in specific places and specific times where those lines are drawn and how they're strained really is a very rich history of the moment. And I think it's just, it's really important because it also helps us understand why some people are harmed. And I care about who gets harmed. But it's just really important to have it be granular and accurate. So that's my interest in the everyday militarism, and why, for me, this is one of the most important images I found in the Imperial War Museum archive when I was researching this talk. There's something about this image that just slays me, we'd have to get psychoanalytic probably to understand why. But the everyday really, the more banal it gets, the more I get really riveted. So there's that, and then the other part, the second part of your
how to read?
Oh, really? Just how to read these images.
Yeah, how to read
what
these.
are they an expression of? Market logics?
Yeah.
Traumatized psychologies?
Yeah, I think that artists, writers, performance art, painters, anybody who tries to address warfare directly faces the problem of sentiment, prurience, a whole range of issues, and how to evoke moral ambiguity without lapsing into, without appealing to people's worst instincts, I think is an artistic challenge that's difficult to meet. And so how we read is also how we produce. And I think that there's a complex cultural interplay between the producers of culture and the consumers and readers of culture. And it's one that we have to all talk about and share more about, so that we are a little more self-conscious about it without removing all of the love and affect that art tends to inspire.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So I have a question and a comment. And my question concerns the American soldiers that were making rocks. Why were they doing this? Was this part of, today we have this where the soldiers, at least they don't do it here in Denmark, but it's pretty big in the States, as far as I know, where art plays a factor in rehabilitating the soldiers. Was this also part of that? Do you know about that? If it's
The soldiers making
rocks, so you
the quilts.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
if that's part of that sort of tendency that we see today, or if it was just for sale. And then
let me answer that, Christine.
Yeah.
The peace quilts from the Crimean War, made by the British soldiers, as I understand it, it was simply to give them something to do, to keep them occupied because they had to stay in bed or stay still for so long, and they had the materials at hand. That's as much as I know about it so far. I'd like to learn more about it.
And then my comment is about a book of poetry that I haven't read, but it's it's right on topic, and it's by, I think she's a British poet called Susan Campbell, and the book is called Tender, and it sort of weaves around the Bayeux tapestry.
Oh yeah.
As a way of sort of writing about the past and current wars, and the role of memory and language in the way we commemorate conflicts. So I thought that would just be of interest to you.
I must make a note of that. I had stuff about the Bayeux tapestry in this talk and pulled it out because it was already getting too long. This was an enormous tapestry primarily created by women that tells the story, that narrates the story of the war. So at that time. So that's a great, thank you. I will make a note. Much appreciated.
Final.
We have time for it. Okay. Yes, thank you so much, Caren. It was really interesting. I try to keep it short. You talked. Yeah, it's related to the everyday militarization you're talking about, which also made me think of Ernst Jünger's this very famous vision of totalization, mobilization of a total mobilization, where also he has this vision of the entire society becoming one organism and making.
I didn't catch the name of
Ernst Jünger, this German.
Jünger.
Jünger.
Yes, pardon me. That's my poor pronunciation.
Sorry, it's maybe Danish pronunciation. But the relation. My question regards the relation between this militarization of civil life. Which you talked a lot about. You also touch about the normalization of military life, But I wonder if you could touch a little bit more about on the relation, if because of course obviously they're interlinked. This also I know you've done a lot on drone like modern drone wars where drone pilots and drone warriors are commuting between home and drone bases. But how do you see this link or this relation between the militarization of civil life and the normalization of military life?
I think that the more I think about, I think many of us like to think that, let me back up one step further. When I first started doing work along these lines, I was mostly in the field of post-colonial studies, and it's really hard for me to imagine understanding the history of colonialism without understanding that it required military force to maintain, right? Yet many of my colleagues in the field didn't want to talk about the military, and even now prefer terms like security and securitization. Some of my best friends, who I love dearly. But I really stick to military because I think the idea of actual force and arms is such an important part of the story, and we can lose it if we just get too far away from it. So I think that, it's not possible to even never mind colonialism. In modernity, you can't even have a nation state without an active military, because you can't defend your borders, right? Or create new borders without a military. So the military is so integrated into the nation that I don't think it's really possible for us to think of ourselves just as civilians, and then the military is this thing that's over there that we can just demonize. If you're progressive, right, you just demonize and reject it. That's ridiculous. Every single thing we do is interconnected. It's interconnected financially and all sorts of ways. So as a citizen of the United States, I have to say I am military to some degree, without imposing on the hardships and sacrifices made by people who serve in the military. But I am connected to the military. I can't say it's other to me at all. I don't really like it, but it's so part of me, of us. So that's where I think these distinctions just don't help us theoretically or in a material kind of way. So, but language fails, right? So how to get past the limits of the language in order to really understand what undergirds the society and makes it run. And then induces how we feel. That's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. I haven't figured it out yet. That's probably my last word. I haven't figured it out yet. Please help.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all your comments and questions.